Okay, we are in the 17th chapter of Life's Ultimate Questions, the textbook for this course in Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics. And Dr. Nash is addressing Ethics 2, the upward path. The previous chapter was Ethics 1, the downward path. And he's quoting the Scottish philosopher who taught in England in the 20th century, Sir David Ross, as Ross is addressing the difference between right acts and morally good actions. And so this is Nash writing. He says, by this distinction, Ross means to draw attention to the fact that any moral behavior can be viewed from at least two perspectives. The first one being, is the moral behavior fitting? Is it the right thing to do? This is ethics on the outside of the act. And so the rightness of an act has nothing to do, he says, with the agent's reasoning for performing it. It's whether or not the act itself is right. The act's rightness is determined solely by whether or not it was the correct, the fitting, the proper thing to do. So I could do this out of the wrong reasons, right? I could tell the truth in such a way that it's actually hurtful. It's morally the right thing to do, but I'm saying it in such a way that my motivations are wrong. Okay, then to help a little old lady across the street is the example he gives. But one can do all sorts of right acts for the wrong reasons. And so this led Ross to the second part of his distinction, morally good actions. An action's morally good if the agent's motives or intentions are good. So here we're considering the inside of the action. And of course, an awful lot of New Testament ethics, especially when we're dealing with Matthew chapters 5 and 6, is of this nature. Jesus is saying that it really matters what our motives are for what we do, especially because God can see the heart. He knows why you're doing what you do. Also, think of Jesus with his disciples sitting in front of the money box in the temple where people would give their offerings and looking at all these wealthy people coming and making offerings, and now a little widow comes up and she puts in her 2 mites, and Jesus tells the disciples that she gave more than all the others did. Now, that's a lesson in saying that God is looking at the heart, God is looking at the motives. Those other folks, some of whom probably gave ostentatiously, gave out of their plenty, but she gave all that she had. And so that had to be giving that came from faith. So God can see the inside of the action. So certainly the Bible addresses both of these things, and biblical morality is addressing both of these things. Excuse me. So these two categories, morally appropriate, has to do with the external act itself, and then the second one, being well-intentioned, has to do with the internal motivation of the one doing it. So there's 4 possibilities if we think in these terms then. A deed can be a right act and a morally good action. It can be a right act and a morally bad action, that my intent was wrong even though the deed is morally right. A deed that's a wrong act and a morally good action. And then a deed that is bad from start to finish. It's the wrong act and it's a morally bad action. So differently stated, the right thing done with a right motivation, the right thing done with a wrongful motivation, the wrong thing done with good intentions, and the wrong thing done with a wrongful motivation. And you probably, maybe Walt, out of my students, recognizes this face. This is Vivien Leigh, and she's the actress who played Scarlett O'Hara in the film Gone with the Wind, the older film Gone with the Wind. And in this picture, her husband Charles Hamilton, the brother of her closest friend Melanie Wilkes, to whom she was married but whom she was not in love with, has died. And now she's gone to a ball, and the appropriate thing for a widow to do at that time historically was for her to be dressed in black and to not be participating in any kind of a festive event. And so in 1862, she attends a fundraising ball for the Confederate Army in Atlanta, where she, as a recent widow, is not supposed to enjoy herself and must remain off to the side wearing a black gown. But she dances covertly behind the counter of her charity stall, receiving looks of disapproval, and the people around her are saying she doesn't really care that her husband's dead. She's not really in mourning. And that's really true. Scarlett is quite a shallow character. Melanie Wilkes, her best friend, is married to Ashley Wilkes, who Scarlett was in love with and who did not want Scarlett's affection and chose Melanie over Scarlett. And what happens is Ashley has been taken as a prisoner of war by the North, and the purpose of this ball is to try to raise some support for the Southern effort in the Civil War. And so Ashley makes the ultimate sacrifice. She comes forward and she brings her wedding ring as a war contribution so that there could be dressings for wounds purchased with it, so there could be food provided for the soldiers, that sort of thing. And then Scarlett follows through with the same kind of thing, and she gives her wedding ring, but she doesn't care about her wedding ring. The difference that you as a viewer feel immediately is that Melanie is giving her most prized possession to the war effort sacrificially, while Scarlett's giving something she doesn't care about all that much. And so many a generous donor to charitable causes does so in order to avoid paying taxes. The motive is egoistic, but it appears to be altruistic. I don't know if you ever thought about it when you're looking at the little program at a basketball game, or if you're at some sort of an art event, whether it's a play or a concert or something, and you see all of these donors who have made these kinds of things possible. Or in my hospital that I go to locally here in Pittsfield, all around the inside of the lobby to the hospital are the names of those who donated to the hospital. And then when I go over to the physical therapy center, the exact same thing. All around the inside of the physical therapy space are the names of people who gave. And only God knows the hearts of those people who gave. The giving itself was a good thing, and that's the idea, but the motive matters. So if a billionaire gives millions to homeless shelters because his accountant tells him he needs to bring his gross income down, or he'll receive huge tax penalties, is his act a morally praiseworthy one? Surely it was good for him to help the homeless shelters, that they need help. However, if he's doing it just for his own benefit, that's certainly not morally praiseworthy. And so the point here that this is getting at is, how important is my motive for my action as regards its moral worth? And only God can see the heart. But when it comes to in the eyes of God, that's what really matters, is not what I did outwardly, but why I did what I did. And so Nash is getting at the principle of justice, and he's addressing it, interestingly, using Aristotle. Now, he's not an Aristotelian. Nash is he's an aficionado of Plato and therefore of Augustine. But I think that Aristotle's work as regards justice is just puts him in the place where he has the best secular, classical approach to the issue of justice and righteousness. So he says, however much the determination of, so we talk about classical analysis, this does mean Plato and Aristotle. However much the determination of a person's due, both Plato and Aristotle say that justice has to do with giving someone their due. And Nash gets into in your text that that's kind of hard to pin down what that is, but they should receive what it is that they're due. It seems clear that the nature of justice involves each person having or receiving that which she is due. However complex the total analysis of justice may become, any adequate inquiry must retain this ancient insight. He's saying, so that there is something here, the idea that this person is either owed or ought to receive certain things in a given situation. And so he addresses that there's two senses of justice, biblically speaking, but also secularly speaking, the universal and the particular sense of justice. And so he brings up the universal using Aristotle, but I have to say it's in the Bible before it's in Aristotle. We believe that the Pentateuch was written at least 800 years before the time of Aristotle. And so we find it in the Genesis account of Noah before we find it in the writings of Aristotle, and we find it also in the laws of the Pentateuch. So the just human being, Nash writes, in Aristotle's universal sense is the person who acts virtuously towards others. This entails being generally virtuous, moral, and a keeper of the law. In other words, being a person of character. And then my comment is that this is eudaimonia, as we've encountered it, being lived out. This person is living out a morally virtuous life. He or she is habituating themselves in virtue. But it's a biblical concept before it's an Aristotelian one. And Nash does make mention of Genesis 6:9. So in the midst of a generation where we read in Genesis 6 that every thought of their heart was only evil continually, there's this man Noah who's a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and who walks with God. And then Nash, so he's the first example of this universal sense of justice. And then Nash brings up that in Ezekiel 18:5, the just or the righteous man is defined as one who does what is lawful and right. In fact, he says, The vast majority of biblical allusions to justice appear to be examples of justice in this universal sense. Attention to this fact, Nash says, is important because many who are anxious to find biblical support for leftist political programs quote many of these passages about justice. What is Nash talking about? He's talking about that these passages are speaking about the individual and what it is for an individual to be a just or a righteous person. But we have folks like Ron Sider, Tony Campolo, there was a whole bunch of them, especially in the late 20th century. I've had opportunity to hear both of those men in person, who were putting forward basically the idea that socialism is Christian. And really socialism is an economic theory and an economic technique or approach that has never worked anywhere. Pure socialism always fails, and it always brings about human suffering. It always has to be mixed with some other system. Okay, so he's saying that these guys take these passages that have to do with universal justice as far as that which is personal and has to do with how a person should conduct themselves as a just person, and they try to make that be about government. He means the biblical passages about what constitutes individual justice or moral uprightness are appropriated by the Christian left in order to prescribe what government ought to be doing. However, these passages are speaking about individual ethics and character, not about governmental ethics. So it's just an aside, and this is he's commenting it on his way through. But I'll just give you a for instance. Lyndon Baines Johnson was president when I was a boy, and he began what we call the War on Poverty, AFDC, Aid for Dependent Children, and different forms of welfare. And especially this was targeted towards the African American population. And at the time that it began, 8 out of 10 African American homes had a father in the home. But today, only 2 out of 10 do. And quite a number of African American social observers, most especially, I can name more than one name, quite a few, but especially John Perkins. John Perkins is now 94. He's a Christian theologian, social activist. He's a leading figure in the African American Christian community. And he has questioned, he says the war on poverty really perhaps ought to be called the war on the poor, because what was done was at a more societal level, rather than having to do with reservations, the same things that were done to the Native American peoples were now done to African American peoples, and they had the same results. We already knew what these social programs did to Native American peoples. It increased illegitimacy as far as births. It seemed to cause or foster a lot more divorce. It seemed to help and enable a lot of alcoholism and lack of work, that sort of thing. So then a particular a segment of the population, the African American part of the population, was targeted with these programs, and it had a lot of negative effects. And so this is something that Perkins, he has a wonderful book called Let Justice Roll Down. He has more than one book, but that's the one that I most especially think of. This is an interview of Perkins with the Gospel Coalition done pretty recently. So Perkins is the one who speaks about this, but we can be wrong-headed is the idea, and we can think that socialism is somehow Christian and a solution to the world's problems. And here's the sort of passage that Nash is speaking about. He actually, on page 358, he gives a whole list of some of the passages that are drawn upon by the Christian left in order to say that this is how we should do government. And you can see here from Job, Job is speaking about his own righteous behaviors. So he says, because I delivered the poor who cried for help and the orphan who had no helper, the blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. This is the kind of universal righteousness or justice that is spoken about a lot in the Old Testament. And so this is the sort of thing that Nash is saying, this is one aspect of DK, or of righteousness. A person is just in the universal sense if he's virtuous and keeps the laws of his country, if he keeps the commandments of God, if he's kind and charitable, if he provides for his family, if he helps the poor. In other words, if he manifests the virtues normally associated with being a moral or a righteous person. So that's the one sense of being just or righteous. And then over on the right-hand side of this figure, you see particular justice. And where we find particular justice, especially in our Bibles, is in the prophets. So from Isaiah to Malachi is where these issues are most especially addressed. And so in particular justice, people are just if they treat others fairly and if they do not grasp after more than they are due. So commercial justice has to do with the exchange of goods and services, and those passages there speak about having righteous or appropriate weights and measures, that when you're weighing out grain or whatever it might be, meat or whatever to somebody, that your balance is one that where the scales are true, not using a 14-ounce weight to represent 16 ounces if I'm trying to give somebody a pound of whatever. When I was growing up, we did have butcher shops, and the big thing was the issue of keeping an eye on the butcher that he didn't put his finger on the scale to make it seem like there was more meat than there actually was there so that he could charge you more. Remedial justice, cases where some wrong must be made right, and Exodus 23, 1 through 9 lists a whole number of those things, but that when something wrong must be made right, it must be made right appropriately. The idea is primarily one of putting that person back in the place where they were before the wrong thing happened or took place. It's not that it's like they won the lottery and they get lots and lots and lots, but it's that they get restored to the place they were before they suffered the injustice. And then distributive justice has to do with this distribution of a good or a burden in an equitable manner. So in Acts 6, we have widows who are the hometown gals from Jerusalem. They grew up in that area. And then we have also other Jewish widows who are from away, in main terminology. They're Hellenistic widows who are Jewish by their faith and belief, and most of them their ancestry as well, but they have recently come to Jerusalem, and so they're a different group of people. They're not those who are as well known. And so what is happening is in the early church that there's an unjust situation because the Hellenistic widows, the widows from away, are not being given food the way that the local widows are being given it. And so that's where we get the appointment of there being deacons. The deacons, the 7 who include Stephen and Philip, that are selected at that point in time, are selected in order to address this issue, distributive justice. So when we talk about the relationship between justice and equality, again, Nash says Aristotle's a good place to begin. For Aristotle, a just action is this: equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally. The concern is with partiality. That if I'm going to get into things that are controversial. I don't want to do that. But the idea is I should be rewarded the same way that others who are of similar status as myself are rewarded when we do or attain or win the same kind of a thing. It's admittedly an insufficient principle of justice. And so Nash says the most serious weakness of the so-called formal principle of justice is the absence of a criterion to identify which of the many ways people can be compared. And so these are relevant questions with regard to justice. He says conformity to this principle will not guarantee justice. For example, a society might decide to treat all members of a particular class alike, but badly. He uses Hitler's Germany. We could also use something like the Jim Crow laws in the South, so that all African Americans were treated a certain way. Equal treatment of equals can be unjust if the criteria by which people are grouped into classes are discriminatory and irrelevant to their claims to justice. The most serious weakness of the so-called formal principle of justice is the absence of a criterion to identify which of the many ways people can be compared and that are relevant to questions of justice. If one's assigning grades in a philosophy class, remember Nash is and was a professor for many years, or deciding the winner of an election, the factors that should count in each case are both different and fairly obvious. It's unlikely that a young man's inability to write a good philosophy essay will disqualify him from membership on a football team, whereas weighing only 70 pounds might. We don't want him to get crushed, right? And so there's things that are appropriate to take into consideration and things that are not. Something more is needed. He says that Aristotle believed that human equality and inequality should count only in instances where the similarity or difference is relevant to what's being distributed. So think of a situation where there are instruments available to an orchestra or a band, And the parentage of a flute player is not relevant to the distribution of flutes to orchestra members. Musical ability is. Also, I would say, with having dealt with this before, whether or not the student seems to show that he or she is willing to practice. It's not enough to add up the ways in which human beings are equal or unequal. One must count only those respects that are relevant to what is being distributed. Aristotle's formal principle leaves open the possibility of discriminatory treatment. It's almost it's almost impossible to get around some sort of a possibility of discriminatory treatment when we're making up the rules. Similar people in similar situations should be treated alike, but the presence of relevant differences also mandates different treatment. Left unstated in Aristotle's account is a principle to identify which differences should count as grounds for unequal treatment. And so, those of you who are parents and who have more than one child know that you can't treat all your children exactly alike. You want to treat them fairly, but if you treat them exactly alike, one child is really tender-hearted and the other one is really strong-willed and not easily brought to a place of sorrow about things. One child is internally motivated and works hard, and the other one is perpetually lazy and tries to procrastinate doing anything. And there's all kinds of differences like that as far as temperament. And so the way you go about parenting is you're trying to be fair, but at the same time you've got to have your behaviors as a parent suit the child that you're dealing with and his or her personality and motivations and temperament. And so, material principles of justice. The most promising candidates for a material principle of justice are well known, he says. They include such factors as ability, past achievement, effort, need, merit, and desert. Desert means what's deserved. That's the way you spell desert, but it just means what's deserved. Depending on the context, the application of any of these criteria might be correct. If it is medical care that's being distributed, the health needs of the patient are relevant. If a parent is distributing praise to her children, the deeds or efforts of the children are relevant. Also the age, right, of the child. We praise differently according to the age because capability varies with age. The distribution of wages is often pertinent to a laborer's work. Great difficulties result from the attempt to elevate any one of these principles to the exclusion of the others. No single all-embracing material principle of distribution can be adequate. Sometimes need is relevant, but not always. Sometimes, but not always, merit should count. So he talks about Robert K. Johnston and the attempt to use need as the exclusive basis for material justice when it comes to just distribution of something that is available. He says the unsoundness of all attempts to push something like need as the exclusive principle of material justice always fails. Sometimes inequalities based on need are just, but many times they're not. A just distribution of grades for a college student should have nothing to do with whether a student needs a particular grade, as many football players used to plead in my university courses. I'm accustomed to having not that kind of a plea made to me except maybe once or twice. What I'm used to having it be is that in certain majors a student had to keep a certain grade point average, and he or she would be appealing to me that they needed to get a higher grade in order to stay in their major. And I would always come up with some sort of an extra credit thing that he or she could do in order to stay in their major. But an awful lot of the time when somebody's in that place, they were undermotivated, and so they weren't willing to do the extra credit. In the case of a college grade, the just grade should be assigned on the basis of what the student has earned, not what he needs. The notion of need is ambiguous. People need things for many different reasons. A student may feel he needs a particular grade in order to stay on the football team, or in order to graduate, or in order to continue on the dean's list so as to qualify for a scholarship, or to increase the student's self-esteem. However much sympathy such needs may generate, they should not be relevant in cases like this. And so I want to say that an awful lot of times when people acquiesce and they give in on these things, those who have the ability to distribute such grades and other things, it's done on the basis of sentiment. And the man or the woman, the professor who is responding in this way, or it might be a boss who's responding in this way, has gone a little soft in the head when they distribute things on this basis, just on the basis of need. Many believe, perhaps rightly, that a good society will not allow certain fundamental and essential human needs to go unmet while a surplus exists. Unfortunately, he says, and he says this rightly, need is too elastic a concept to serve as the precise standard required for distributive justice. Needs have a way of being generated and expanded as people become accustomed to former luxuries. And this is difficult. In a wealthy country like our own, a lot of times we take things that are not our needs, they are our preferences, they are our wants, and we think of them as needs. If need is to function as one of the several material principles of justice, society must find some way to identify the essential needs in a given situation. We could use Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting at the bottom and moving our way up. It's also unclear whether the efforts of a society to meet such essential needs should be described as justice or charity. Ought to be a category for charity. The Old Testament has it, and even secular law has a category for charity. And it's not necessarily indicated that these things are always justice. It's not always that these things are owed, that this is what is owed to this individual, this is what is due to them. But sometimes it's that we have compassion, we're moved with compassion, and ought to be. So summary, what should we learn from a study of classical discussion of justice? First, justice occurs in situations where people receive their due. It's Aristotelian, and it seems to square with biblical truth. Distributive justice occurs in situations where equals are treated equally and unequals are treated unequally. But this knowledge, 3, won't get us very far until we discover some principle that will tell us the relevant respects on which equal and unequal treatment should be based. And 4, several clearly inappropriate material principles of justice were identified. 5, the criteria that may be appropriate are many and varied, and no one of them will work in every case. And then lastly, while much about the notion of justice remains unclear, it is certain that justice and equality are not equivalent. Sometimes equal treatment is just, often it's not. Frequently justice will require that people be treated differently. But in all circumstances of life, we should seek to treat people fairly, a fact that requires us to seek the relevant ways in which different people are alike and also dissimilar. Now, under the next heading, he gets into law. He reminds you that it would be helpful to go back to chapter 7 and look at what we learned about law when we were dealing with Thomas Aquinas and especially the natural law. He goes on to say, many human experiences seem to point to the existence of moral laws or standards of behavior. Our failure to do something that we believe we ought to do may lead us to feel guilt. The failure of others to perform certain duties towards us may produce feelings of resentment or anger or sorrow. So we have a sense of what we're responsible for and also a sense of what others are responsible for. Whenever we dare to suggest to someone else that his conduct is wrong, Nash says we're doing more than appealing to our own moral standard. We're assuming that he or she shares a standard with us. Moral criticism like this would make no sense unless we also believed that the other person knew about the same moral standard. It is interesting to note that the person whose moral conduct is being criticized seldom denies the existence of the moral standard. That is, such people seldom try to argue that there's nothing wrong with cheating, stealing, or lying. Such people attempt rather to find some way of showing that what they did doesn't violate the principle, or at least it's a justifiable exception to the moral standard. I had special circumstances, which was the reason why it was okay for me to do this. So this is an extended quote from Lewis that Nash gives us in the book. This is from Mere Christianity. I just want to remind you that Mere Christianity, these were talks given on the radio, on the BBC during World War II. And these are things that the common people really identified with. Lewis became incredibly popular during this time for these talks. And then somebody decided to bring all these talks together and put them in the book Mere Christianity. But Lewis just gave these as talks at the request or the behest of the BBC. So picture him with his deep British accent. I'm not going to try to approximate it, saying, everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I give you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always he tries to make out that what he's been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. He pretends there's some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of a law or rule of fair play, or decent behavior, or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed, and they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they would not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong, and there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a soccer player, that's what a footballer is in England, that a footballer had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football, like hand, you used your hand, that kind of thing. So he's saying that we know these rules, we share them, we have them in common. And Nash gets into, on page 363, the moral law a bit, and he emphasizes the factual, real objectivity of the law, that it's not something that we can ultimately equivocate about. When we deal with objective truth, Nash says, it does not matter whether we like it, it's true and that's all there is to it. In a similar way, the moral law is independent of our feelings and desires. Again, he goes back to Lewis and to mere Christianity. Lewis says there's nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. The moral law, comments Nash, does not care whether we like it or whether we want to obey it or whether we're disposed to do it. It informs us that this is our duty, now do it. So he says the belief in the existence of an objective and universal moral law qualifies as a rational belief. And as somebody whose research has been most especially in the field of ethics and of dealing with the natural law, I have to say that that's really true. I've never had anybody say to me that they would disagree with that. For anyone who recognizes this fact, the next natural step is to ask what is the source and the ground of the moral law. So then, Nash gives us an extended quote from the English philosopher, priest, he's both, Hastings Roshtal. Hastings Roshtal, remember in the end of the last talk, Nash spoke about ideal utilitarians as opposed to hedonistic utilitarians. He grouped G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, and I added Henry Sidgwick as being ideal utilitarians, and he grouped Bentham and Mills as being hedonistic utilitarians. And so Roshtal is a late 19th, early 20th century figure who's of that same group. And he is also what's called he's a theistic finitist, meaning that he doesn't believe that God is infinite, he doesn't believe that God is eternal, he doesn't believe that God is omnipotent. But interestingly, listen to him write about God, because he does believe that if there is any kind of a moral law, the place it has to exist is in the mind of God. He says, we say that the moral law has a real existence, that there is such a thing as an absolute, meaning objective. Morality that there is something absolutely, let me try that again. We say that the moral law has a real existence, that there is such a thing as an absolute morality, that there is something absolutely true or false in ethical judgments, whether we or any number of human beings at any time, actually think so or not. We must therefore face the question of where such an ideal exists and what manner of existence we are to attribute to it. And this is always one of the pushbacks with regard to the idea of objective moral values. It's like, where does this exist? Are you talking about something like the world of the forms in Plato? Are we saying that there is really such a thing? What kind of a thing are you describing as being objective? So what Roshtal says is, certainly it is to be found wholly and completely in no individual human consciousness. Only if we believe in the existence of a, notice that it's capitalized, mind, for which the true moral ideal is already in some sense real, a mind, which is the source of whatever is true in our own moral judgments, only if that's the case can we rationally think of the moral ideal as no less real than the world itself. Only so can we believe in an absolute standard of right and wrong, which is as independent of this or that belief in God. And he goes on to say, it is the logical presupposition of an objective or an absolute morality, what he's describing. A moral ideal can exist nowhere and no how but in a mind. An absolute moral ideal can exist only in a mind from which all reality is derived. There's only one mind that could be that mind. That's the mind of God. Our moral ideal can only claim objective validity insofar as it can rationally be regarded as the revelation of a moral ideal eternally existing in the mind of God. That's interesting. That's and what that harmonizes with, of course, is Nash's Platonism and his Augustinianism. Plato has one locale for this, but Augustine has another, and Augustine does not locate it in the world of the forms, but he locates it in the mind of God, and that's something that Nash strongly agrees with. Nash then asks, which worldview best explains our consciousness of an objective moral order? He says, Christian theism must be considered a leading candidate. I have to say, with it having been that my research is most especially in this area, I find Christian theism to be the leading candidate. Then he gets into virtue and character for just a little bit, and he says, it is not enough that we do the right thing, as important as performing the right act is. We should also make sure that our deeds are morally good actions in the sense that they reflect morally good motives, something that seems unlikely in the case of people who have not been attentive to their character. So as Christians, we understand that we are to be growing in Christ, we're to be maturing, we're to be putting to death the old nature, be putting on Christ. We read in the Scriptures that the Holy Spirit's at work in us in order to work the character of Christ in us. And so the believer cooperatively, synergistically, is working in accordance with the Holy Spirit, not only as far as the Spirit confronts the things that are awry in him or her, but also by being in the Word of God and being in prayer and being in fellowship. These are things that help work this virtue and character in the Christian. He gets into now love, law, and the Christian ethic. The fact that all human beings carry the image of God explains why human beings are creatures capable of reasoning, love, and God consciousness. It also explains why we are creatures capable of moral behavior. And he goes on to say, of course, sin has distorted the image of God and explains why humans turn away from God and the moral law, why we often go wrong with regard to our emotions, conduct, and thinking. So 2 principles here, that we are made in God's image and also that we are fallen, and so we are sinful, that these 2 things help us to understand how we can have the law of God within and yet fail to keep it. Because of the image of God, we should expect to find that the ethical recommendations of the Christian worldview reflect what all of us at the deepest levels of our moral being know to be true. As Lewis pointed out, once again he's back in Mere Christianity, Christ did not come to preach any brand new morality. Really great moral teachers never do introduce new moralities. It's quacks and cranks that do that. The real job of every moral teacher is to keep on bringing us back time after time to the old simple principles which we are all so anxious not to see. And I can't flesh it out here, but I want to say this is really true even from faith to faith. Now, it's not just within Christianity that this is true, but in other faiths also, that the essence of what is considered to be ethically and morally right is much the same. So he goes on to say, when one examines the moralities of different cultures and religions, certain differences do stand out. But Lewis was much more impressed by the basic underlying similarities. So Lewis puts this forward, and it's a thought provoker. He says, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle. And you're not going to be able to think of one. Or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. Again, you're not going to be able to think of that one either. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. Men have differed as regards what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it's your own family or your fellow countrymen or everyone. But they've always agreed that you should not put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. So Nash says, according to the Christian worldview, God is the ground of the laws that govern the physical universe, and that makes possible the order of the cosmos. God is the ground of the moral laws that ought to govern human behavior, and that makes possible order between Christians and between humans and within humans. Then he says, Christian theism must insist that there are universal moral laws. In other words, the laws must apply to all humans, regardless of when or where they have lived. They must also be objective in the sense that their truth is independent of human preference and desire. This is one of the things that's most offensive about Judaism and Christianity, is this insistence that there is a law and that judges human behaviors. This is why human beings suppress the knowledge of God that they have, per Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following. And so this is Francis Schaeffer in his book, The Church at the End of the 20th Century. He says, historic Christianity, biblical Christianity, believes that Christianity is not just doctrinal truth, but flaming truth. True to what is there. True to the great final environment, the infinite personal God. And so this is something that people know within themselves, even though they try to suppress it. It's there. It's just that God is the maker. Famously, it is, I'm going to say the wrong name. It's Kuyper, Abraham Kuyper, who was the former prime minister of the Netherlands, who wrote, and he said, there is not 1 square inch of all of creation over which God, who is omnipotent, does not cry out, mine. Or Jesus Christ, who's omnipotent, does not cry out, mine. It's his. Everything was made by him, and so it all bears witness to him. Now, Nash, towards the end, as he's getting near the end of the chapter, he talks about the difference between principles and rules. He talks about how principles are more general, and they don't give a lot of specificity, whereas rules give specificity, but that thereby limits them. And so rules are not as generally applicable as principles are. He talks about some things from the New Testament where that's the case. Head coverings for women, there's a number of different things. Meat sacrificed to idols. I'm going to just give you something that comes from Jerry Bridges from his book, The Pursuit of Holiness, where he addresses principles with regard to how to know right from wrong. So he quotes from 1 Corinthians 8, and he's talking about meat sacrificed to idols and how some Christians, he also speaks about this in Romans 14, have a freedom to partake of meat sacrificed to idols that was then sold out in the marketplace, because that doesn't bother their conscience because they have never been idol worshippers. But if my eating of meat sacrificed to idols with a fellow believer who used to worship idols, if that causes him to fall or causes him to sin, then he says, verse 13, therefore if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. Think about this in terms of our world. We don't have a big problem with meat sacrificed to idols these days, but Christians have, I believe, biblically speaking, a freedom to partake of alcohol, not to abuse alcohol, but to partake of alcohol. And there are those who are teetotalers because it's their own conviction that that's what the Word of God teaches. That's a harder position to defend. But there's also those who are teetotalers just because they've gotten sober and they don't want to go back to the place of dealing with drunkenness and with their alcoholism. I have a friend by the name of Joe Moskaluk who says he's only been drunk twice in his life, the first time for 12 years and the second time for 7 years. And so the possibility exists that if I drink in the presence of a brother or sister for whom this is a problem, if I partake of alcohol in their presence, I might encourage them to go back into their former alcoholic state. And so that's the kind of thing that Paul's saying. I don't want to cause my brother to stumble. So that's the first of these principles. They go on. The next one is in 1 Corinthians 6:12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. So think of any freedom that you have that you can't keep control over, that it seems you're obsessed about it. That's being mastered by it. It can be something as simple as social media. It's according to you and to what your own weaknesses or besetting sins are. The third principle here, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. And so you might be exercising a freedom that you have as a Christian, but it's not edifying for you. In fact, it's the opposite. And so that's a thing to cease and desist from doing. Then the last thing is then whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So what Bridges would say is these four principles are, before you exercise a freedom, is it going to cause a brother or a sister around you or that you're dealing with to stumble or fall? And then secondly, is it mastering you? Is it having more control over you than it ought to? And then thirdly, is it having an unhealthy, non-edifying effect upon you? And then lastly, are you doing it to the glory of God? So these are principles, and principles are more broad and more general. So there's a precision versus an imprecision when we're dealing with principles versus rules. And especially I would say that Romans 14 is a place to go and see the discussion that takes place there about this kind of thing. I want to talk about a couple and the lack of rules that one encounters. I'm a pastor, and I was a pastor for 44 years, and I was a pastor to Winslow and Dot Dean. They're both now deceased. And Winslow had kidney failure. When I met Winslow, he's probably about 6'4", and back then he probably weighed close to 300 pounds, most all of which was muscle, and he was up in his 70s. And Dot was his wife. Maybe she was 5'6" or 5'7", and she was a little thing by comparison to her husband. And she was a high-strung individual as opposed to her husband too, and he was kind of a larger-than-life kind of character. Well, Winslow got kidney disease, and he went from being, like 6'3" and close to 300 pounds down to being 6'3" and 140 pounds. And he kept coming right to the edge of death but not dying, and he was on dialysis. And I had to drive them to the hospital many times because Dot didn't drive, and Winslow was not feeling well enough to be driven when he was in extremis. And so they got to the point where Winslow was living day and night in a reclining chair. And he was so sick and so depleted that he just slept all the time, and he would wake up to eat and go for these dialysis sessions. And he kept on coming to the edge of death. Well, what this was doing to Dot, I said to you that Dot was a little high-strung, it was bringing Dot to the, it was causing her to have health problems herself because she kept getting herself ready for her husband, who she loved more than anyone else, to die. And she'd steel herself against that and come to the edge of that, and then it wouldn't happen. And it happened, like I said, like 14 or 15 times. Finally, they asked to sit down with me in all my 32-year-old brilliance and deep wisdom, meaning I didn't have that, and they asked me whether or not it was right or wrong for Winslow to desist from having the dialysis, that this was no kind of a life, and that it was putting a terrible strain on Dot, and that he was afraid that Dot was going to break as long as the strain continued to be in her life, and that he loved her, and that they're not really being able to enjoy life together, and he wasn't really taking pleasure in food, to tell the truth, either. And so I said to them, I didn't know. I didn't know what the answer was. And I went back and I prayed, and there's no place in the Bible that says thou shalt or thou shalt not receive dialysis. And then I'd been praying and asking people to pray with me about it, my wife, meaning people. And eventually I woke up in the middle of the night and I felt that God had spoken to me. There was a realization that I had an aunt, my Aunt Jean, who, when I was in my teens, had died of kidney disease because at the time there was no such thing as dialysis. And so dialysis had been created since that time. And it was the presence or the existence of dialysis that allowed us to do these extreme measures that helped to filter the impurities out of Winslow's system that was keeping him alive. And so, as far as I could tell, what the Lord was impressing on me was that if Winslow had been alive when my Aunt Jean was alive, he would have just died a natural death. His body was trying to die now because his kidneys no longer worked. And so I didn't see that there was anything sinful. He wasn't actively killing himself. He was just allowing nature to run its course if he stopped taking this medicine. So the medicine was making a wreck of both him, or the treatment was making a wreck of him and Dot. And so what happens, I guess, if you stop with dialysis, you're gone pretty quickly, and it's a fairly painless death. He was gone in 3 days by ceasing to receive the dialysis. And Dot was able to then be able to grieve the loss of her husband and to recover. And so there's not always rules that tell us what's the just or the right thing to do, but there's principles. And the principles I felt generally, with regard from the Word of God, that were there were helpful ones, and ultimately, of course, feeling like I'd had an answer to my prayer in the Lord impressing that on me in the nighttime. Romans 14 is the place to go if you want to engage this sort of thing further, and I think we wind up there. Yes, we do. Okay.